The cup was at the king's place, poured and waiting. The way a cup had waited at that place every single night for 10 years, and I knocked it over on purpose with my sleeve. 400 people saw me do it. 400 people saw a laundry servant reach across the head of the king's own table and spill his wine across the cloth, and every one of them thought they were watching a woman lose her mind. And I let them think it. Because the alternative was letting the King of Redmarsh drink what I had smelled coming off that cup. The same faint grey-green thread I had spent 3 weeks smelling in a 10-year-old physician's record. The same thread that had killed his mother and his father, and his brother and his sister in the space of 1 week, and been written down, by the man standing nearest the cup, as a fever. "Grey fever," I said into the silence, to the whole hall. "That's what you called it, my lord. I'd like everyone here to know it doesn't smell like a fever. It smells like that." 11 weeks earlier, I had arrived at Redmarsh on a cart with a bundle of clothes, and no one had thought to tell me which chair I was not allowed to sit in. My name is Rowena, and I came to the keep to do laundry, which is a long way down from what my mother did, and I was grateful for it. I was 6 and 20 that autumn. My mother had been a healer, a real one, trained, sought after 3 villages around. And she taught me the whole of it before the coughing sickness took her, and for a few years I thought I would carry the trade on after her. Then the debts she left turned out to be larger than the trade, and a healer's daughter, with no coin and no standing, is just a woman who knows too much to be comfortable around. And the work dried up the way it does when people would rather not be reminded of a woman who died. And in the end I sold the last of my mother's jars, and took the only post I could find, which was carrying laundry at a keep 3 days from anywhere I knew. I arrived after dark on my first night, cold and stupid with the length of the road, and the steward's under-clerk who was meant to settle me had gone to bed, and the woman who showed me to the servants' quarters told me there would be food left in the small hall, and to help myself and be up at first light. She did not tell me which hall was the small one. I want to be fair to her, because I have thought about this a great deal. She was tired, and I was one more body in a keep full of bodies, and she assumed, the way people do, that anyone would know, that some things are so obvious in a place you have lived your whole life that it does not occur to you a stranger could fail to know them. She pointed down a corridor and said the hall's that way and went to bed, and I went that way, and I came to a hall. It was not the small one. It was the great hall of Redmarsh, and it was empty, and it was lit, low, banked. A few candles left burning the way you leave them for someone expected, and there was a long table down the length of it, laid from end to end. Laid properly, places set for 12, more, with good plates and cups, and a meal actually put out. Barley and lamb gone cold, bread, a jug of wine. I did not think anything of it except that I was starving, and that here, plainly, was the food I had been told to help myself to. I was so tired. I want you to understand how tired, because it is the only thing that explains what I did. 3 days on a cart, no sleep worth the name, cold to the bone, and here was a warm enough hall and a laid table, and no one in it, and I did the thing the woman had told me to do. I helped myself. I sat down at the head of the table, in the big chair, the good one, because it was nearest the fire and my legs would not carry me 1 step further than they had to, and I ate the cold barley and lamb that had been set at that place, and I drank a little of the wine, and the warmth of it and the food and 3 days of nothing came down on me all at once, and I put my head down on my arms on the King of Redmarsh's own table, in the King of Redmarsh's own chair, and I fell asleep. I did not wake when the hall filled. I have been told it filled quietly, that the household came in the way it always came in the last hour before the king took his late meal, and found a strange woman asleep in his chair with his supper eaten in front of her, and that a silence went through them, that no one alive at Redmarsh had ever heard in that hall before. I did not wake when the king came in. That is the part the whole court has never gotten over. I slept through it. King Steinar of Redmarsh came into his own great hall to take the meal he had taken alone at the head of that table every night for 10 years, and found a laundry servant asleep in his place with his own cup empty in front of her. And I did not so much as stir, and he stood there, I have been told, for a long time, long enough that men began to shift on their feet, and he did not wake me, and he did not have me removed. He said, very quietly, "Leave her." And then, when the steward began to protest, when Lord Estrin began, in a low, urgent voice, to explain to his king all the reasons a thing like this could not simply be left, the King of Redmarsh said it again, in a voice that ended the discussion. "Leave her. Let her sleep. Put the candles out around her, and leave her be." And they did. 400 people filed out of that hall and left a strange woman asleep in the king's chair. And the king himself was the last to go, and I slept through the whole of it, and the first I knew of any of it was waking near dawn to find a fur laid over my shoulders that had not been there when I put my head down. I did not know, that first morning, that I had done a thing no one at Redmarsh believed could be done and survived. I found out what I had done from the laundry women, who could not decide whether I was blessed or doomed and settled on treating me as both. They told me about the table. 10 years ago, they said, the grey fever came to Redmarsh. It came fast, faster than any fever anyone had seen. And it took the old King Osgood and his queen and their 2 younger children, the prince and the little princess, in the space of a single week. All 4. The only one it spared was the eldest son, Steinar, who was 19 and away at the border keep the whole of that week, and who came home to find his family in fresh graves and the great hall exactly as they had left it on the last night they had all eaten together, before the queen took to her bed. And he had never let it be changed. That was the thing. That was what the whole keep had organised itself around for 10 years. The King of Redmarsh had the great hall laid every single night. The full table, a dozen places, the meal put out, and he ate at the head of it alone, in his father's chair, at a table set for a family that had been 10 years in the ground, and no living soul had sat in any of those chairs since. Because to sit in one was to sit in a dead person's place. And no one at Redmarsh would have dreamed of it, except a laundry servant 3 days off a cart, who did not know, and who had, of all the chairs in that hall, chosen his. He should have had you flogged, old Merrin the wash mistress told me, not unkindly, wringing a sheet. By every rule there is, he should have. You ate the king's own supper in the king's own chair on the anniversary week. Girl, that meal on that table is a grave offering. Do you understand me? It's set for the dead, and you ate it like a stray. And he stood there and told them to leave you. She shook her head. He watched you breathe, they're saying. Stood there in that dead hall and watched a living person breathe in his father's chair, and something went out of his face that hasn't been in it in 10 years, and none of us know what to do with it, and neither does he. I want to tell you, I felt only horror. I felt a great deal of horror. But underneath it, and I am not proud of this, I felt something else, which was the specific ache of a person who has just learned that the worst mistake of her life happened to be the exact shape of another person's 10-year wound, and fit into it. He sent for me that evening. I went certain I was going to be dismissed at best, and I found him not in a throne room but in the great hall itself, alone, standing at the head of the table, looking at the chair I had slept in as though it had done something to him. "Nobody told you," he said. "Not a question. No, Your Grace. I'm new. I didn't know it was. I didn't know what any of it was. I would never have, I know." He was quiet for a moment. "That is why I could not have you punished. I have spent 10 years keeping the whole of this keep frightened of these chairs, and a woman walked in who had never been taught to be frightened, and sat in the worst one, and ate a dead family's supper, and slept like a child who had finally reached somewhere safe. His voice did something. Do you know what I felt, standing here? Not anger. I have been waiting to feel anger these 2 days, because anger would be simpler. I came into this hall the way I have come into it every night for 10 years, to sit with them, and for the first time in 10 years, there was someone alive in it. And I did not want to make you leave. I did not know what to say to that. So I said the true thing, which is a habit I have never been able to break. Your Grace, forgive me, but why do you still set the table? He looked at me as though no one had asked him that in 10 years, which, I would learn, was exactly the case. The court, meanwhile, could not put me down. I do not mean they were kind. I mean the opposite, that a laundry servant who had slept in the king's chair and lived became the single thing the whole of Redmarsh could not stop turning over, and turned it over out loud, for weeks, in a way that made my ordinary life nearly impossible. Ranked women who would not have looked at me on the road came to the wash-house to look at me now, the way you go to look at a thing that should not exist. A steward's clerk asked me, in genuine bewilderment, what I had done. Not the sitting. He knew about the sitting. He meant what had I done to the king? What art? What trick? That he would tell 400 people to leave a stranger asleep in his father's chair. I told him I had done nothing but be too tired to know better, and he did not believe me, because the truth was worse than a trick. A trick they could have understood. That is the thing no one warns you about doing an impossible thing by accident. Everyone assumes it was on purpose, because the alternative, that the deepest wound in the keep could be reached by a woman who simply did not know it was there, is more frightening than any scheme. A scheme has a schemer you can remove. An accident that fits a wound, that perfectly suggests something about the wound, and no one at Redmarsh wanted to think about what. Old Merrin told me to keep my head down and let it blow over. And I tried, and it did not blow over. Because every evening the king sent for me again, and every evening 400 people watched me walk to the great hall no one else would enter. And the not blowing over got worse, and I understood that I had become, without meaning to, the most talked about person in a keep where I had come specifically to not be talked about at all. I did not know yet what setting that table had cost, or who had been so very careful to make sure it was never questioned. If you want to find out what a healer's daughter smells at a grave offering that 400 people had bowed to for 10 years, and what it cost to tell a grieving king that his family was murdered, stay with me. What I found in a physician's 10-year-old record is the reason there is anyone left at Redmarsh to tell it. He did not dismiss me. He did the opposite, which the court found even harder to bear. He kept me near. Not grandly, there was nothing improper in it, and he was careful, always, that there was nothing improper in it. But he found reasons. He would send for me to the great hall in the evenings, and we would talk, and it took me some time to understand that he did it, because I was the one person at Redmarsh who was not frightened of that hall, because I had not been there long enough to learn the fear, and that being in it with someone unafraid was the first thing in 10 years that had made it bearable. He talked to me about them. That was the thing that undid me. He had not spoken of his family, really spoken of them, in 10 years, because everyone at Redmarsh had been so careful with him for so long that his grief had become a thing to be tiptoed around rather than shared, and here was a laundry servant who had not learnt the tiptoeing, and to me he could simply say, my brother would have hated all this ceremony. My sister was 6. My mother laughed too loud for a queen, and my father loved it. He said these things the way a man says things he has been carrying alone, with relief, and I listened the way my mother taught me to listen at a sickbed, which is to say completely. And somewhere in the fourth week, he said the thing that changed everything, and he said it lightly. The way you say a thing you have said to yourself 1,000 times until it stopped meaning anything. The strange thing, he said, is how fast it took them. My mother was well on the Tuesday. She was in her garden. And by the next Tuesday, all 4 of them were gone. And I have never in 10 years understood how a fever moves that fast through a keep and touches no one else. Not a servant, not a guard. Only my family, only that week, only the 4 of them. And then it was simply gone. I had been half listening, the way you do. And then I was not half listening, because I am a healer's daughter, and my mother's voice was suddenly very loud in my head, and it was saying the thing she used to say. A sickness that takes only the people at one table is not a sickness, Rowena. A sickness does not read the seating. Something in me went very still and very clear. Your Grace, I said, carefully, who else ate at that table that week? Everyone, the household. It was a full hall, it was always a full hall then. He frowned. Why? And they were all well. All well. Then it was not a fever, I said, before I had decided whether it was wise to say it. Your Grace, I'm sorry, I know what I'm. A fever doesn't take 4 people at one end of a hall and leave 400 untouched. It can't. It doesn't know who to take. Whatever killed your family knew exactly where they sat. He went so still that I thought I had made a terrible mistake. You are a laundry servant, he said, slowly. I'm a healer's daughter. Your Grace, my mother trained me before she died. I've sat more sick beds than you've had years, and I have never once in my life seen a fever choose a table. I asked to see the record. There was one. There is always one. A royal death is written down, symptom by symptom, day by day, by whatever physician attended it, and the record of the grey fever had been kept. Of course it had, and it had sat in the Keep's archive for 10 years, and no one had read it since. Because who reads the account of the worst week of their life on purpose, and who else would dare ask? It took Erland, the king's second, most of a day to find it, and when he brought it Steinar could not open it, and so I opened it, and I read it the way my mother taught me to read a record, which is looking for what does not fit. Everything did not fit. The symptoms written down were not a fever's. There was no sweat, no flush, none of the heat that gives a fever its name. There was a greyness, a cold, a slow failing of the breath, and a specific thing the physician had noted and clearly not understood, which was a faint discoloration at the lips that he had put down to the cold of the sick room. My mother had a name for that discoloration. It is not a name you use about a fever. It is a name you use about a particular preparation of a particular root, given slowly, over days, in food or in drink, that mimics a wasting sickness closely enough to fool a frightened physician and kills too quietly to fight. And there was one more thing, at the very bottom, in a different hand, a note added after, brief and administrative, that the sickroom stores and the kitchen stores for that week had been inspected and found clean, and that the household was not at fault, and that the inspection had been carried out and certified by the master of the household. Lord Estrin, who had held that office for 11 years, who set the table every night, who had, 10 years ago, been the man in charge of every mouthful of food and drink that reached the royal family, and the man who inspected the stores after they died, and the man who certified that there was nothing to find, and who had spent 10 years since being the most tender, the most careful, the most encouraging keeper of a grieving king's ritual, because a king who eats every night with his murdered family and calls it grief, and never once asks why the fever chose a table, is a king who will never look in the one place the answer has been sitting the whole time. I understood, sitting in that archive, exactly what I had walked into. and exactly why a man who inspected his own crime had been so very gentle with the boy who survived it. Estrin had not killed to take the throne for himself. He had no claim. He was a household officer. He had killed for the men who paid him. A border house that had wanted the old King Osgood gone before he could sign a treaty that would have cost them, and who had not counted on the eldest son surviving at the border. The plot had half failed. Osgood died, but Steinar lived and inherited, and a half-failed plot is the most dangerous kind, because the men who paid for it still had a bought man inside the keep, and a king who did not know his own family had been murdered, and the safest thing in the world for all of them was a king frozen in grief at a laid table, mourning a fever. Forever, for 10 years, Estrin had kept him there. Every set table, every gentle word, every careful tending of the ritual, it had all been the work of a man making very sure the wound never healed, because a healed king is a king who starts asking questions. And then a laundry servant fell asleep in the chair, and the king began, for the first time in 10 years, to thaw. Estrin moved within the week. His first move was gentle, because his moves were always gentle. That was the whole of his craft. He went to the king, sorrowfully, and observed that the household was unsettled, that the servant who had committed the desecration of the chair had since been seen constantly in the king's private company, that the woman had a healer's training and a dead mother's debts, and every reason to attach herself to a lonely king, and that whatever comfort she had brought his grace, a master of the household's first duty was to protect his king from those who would exploit his grief. He asked, with great regret, that I be dismissed, for the king's own protection. It was very nearly enough. It was reasonable, and it was kind, and half of what he said was even true. I was a healer's daughter, with a dead mother's debts, who had attached herself to a lonely king, and there is no way to say that out loud that does not sound exactly like the thing Estrin wanted it to sound like. Steinar did not dismiss me, but I watched the doubt do its work in the hall around us, and I understood that a second move was coming, because a man who has kept a secret for 10 years does not stop at a sorrowful word once the secret is in danger. The second move was the cup. He did the only thing left to a man in his position, which was the thing that had worked before. If the king was thawing, if the king was beginning to ask, then the king, sadly, tragically, would take a sudden turn. The old grief, everyone would say, the strain of it, a weak heart broken at last by 10 years of mourning, and a new grief would settle over Redmarsh, and a bought household officer would go on serving whoever came next. He used the same route. He was that certain of it. 10 years of no one looking meant 10 years of a man growing careless. In the one way careful men grow careless, which is that they come to believe the thing that has never been noticed cannot be noticed. He put it in the king's cup, at the king's place, at the head of the laid table, on the anniversary week, because the symmetry of it must have pleased something in him, and because he had done it there before, and no one had ever smelled a thing. But I am a healer's daughter, and my mother taught me that particular route by making me smell it 100 times until I would know it in the dark, so that I would never once give it to a patient by accident. And I had spent 3 weeks with the physician's record, open in front of me, learning exactly what I was looking for. I smelled it the moment I entered that hall. The cup was at the king's place, poured and waiting, and I did the only thing there was time to do, which was to knock it over with my sleeve in front of 400 people, and then, because a spilled cup proves nothing and can be poured again, to say the thing out loud, in the hall of the dead, in the chair I had slept in, that no one had dared say in 10 years. Grey fever, I said. It smells like that. The hall did not understand, but Estrin did, and Estrin, who had been gentle and careful and patient for 11 years, made the single mistake that patient men make when the unnoticed thing is finally noticed. He moved toward me, fast, to take the cup, or the cloth, or me. And a room full of people who had spent 10 years bowing to that man's tenderness watched him lunge across the king's own table at a laundry servant and understood, all at once, that they were looking at something they had never once looked at properly. Erland had him before he reached me. And Steinar, who had gone the colour of the cloth, who had spent 10 years mourning a fever 3 feet from the man who poured it, did not order anything at all for a long moment. Because I do not think a man can, in the moment he learns that his entire grief was manufactured to keep him quiet. It came apart the way these things come apart. Estrin confessed nothing, because there was, in the end, no single admissible thing to confess. The root was in the spilled cup. But a spilled cup can be argued, and a 10-year-old record proves poison, but not a poisoner. And a self-certified inspection proves only that a man certified his own work. What finished him was not any one proof. It was that once the King of Redmarsh finally asked the question he had been kept from asking for 10 years, who paid you, the answer had a paper trail. Because the border house that had bought him had gone on paying him, quietly, for 10 years, to keep a grieving king grieving. And a decade of quiet payments to a household steward is a very great deal of paper for a chancellor's men to find once someone finally tells them to look. The old king's death was reopened, and named for what it was, and it took the better part of 2 years to follow every payment to its end, and 3 ranked houses on the border fell with it. And I gave evidence twice, and none of it gave Steinar back a Tuesday in a garden. I want to tell you what it cost, because it was not free. It cost him his grief. That sounds like a strange thing to grieve, but I watched it happen, and I know it for what it was. For 10 years he had mourned a sickness, a cruel, blameless thing, an act of the world, the kind of loss you can eventually make a kind of peace with, because there is no one to hate. And in one evening that was taken from him and replaced with murder. With the knowledge that his family had been killed on purpose, slowly, at their own table, and that he had sat at that table every night for 10 years, being tended by the man who did it. You cannot make peace with that the way you make peace with a fever. He had 10 years of grieving to do over again, from the beginning, in the true shape this time, and it was harder, and I do not think it is finished even now. And it cost me the thing I had come to Redmarsh to have, which was to be nobody. I had wanted a small life, laundry and quiet, and no one knowing my name. And I stood up in a great hall, and became the woman who smelled the king's poison, and I have never once been nobody since. And there are days I miss it more than I can say. Steinar asked me in the spring, and he did it in the great hall, which I understood before he said a word. The table was cleared by then. That was the first thing he had done, once the truth was out. Not in anger, but slowly, with his own hands, over a whole night, clearing 10 years of grave offerings from a table that had never been a memorial at all, but a leash. He kept one chair, his father's, at the head, the one I had slept in. Everything else he cleared, and the hall he had eaten alone in for 10 years he opened to the household, so that it filled every night with living people, which the master of that hall had spent a decade making certain it never did. I am not going to pretend this began well, he said. You committed the worst offence in this keep on your first night, and I fell in love with you for it, which is not a story anyone should tell their children. He almost smiled. But you sat down in the one chair no one would sit in, and you slept in it like it was safe, and you were the first warm living thing in this hall in 10 years. And then you smelled what 400 people had bowed to and could not smell, and gave me back my family in the true shape, even though the true shape is the harder one to carry. I would rather carry the true one with you than the false one alone. Stay, you're aware I ate your dead family's supper. I am aware, said the King of Redmarsh, that they would have liked you enormously, and that my sister would never have let me hear the end of it. and that this is the first time in 10 years I have been able to say a thing like that and smile instead of break. Stay, I kissed him first. In that hall, in front of the one chair he had kept. It was brief, and it was warm, and it settled something in me that had been braced since I sold the last of my mother's jars and decided I would rather be nobody than be a healer no one would let heal. 2 years on, the Great Hall of Redmarsh is the loudest room in the keep. That was mine. In a way, I could not bear the quiet of it, after what the quiet had been for, and so I filled it, and Steinar let me. And now it is full every night of household and guards and children and noise, and the one chair he kept sits at the head of it, his father's, and no one sits in it, and no one is frightened of it either. It is not a grave anymore. It is just a place a good man is remembered, in a loud room, which is what his mother, the queen who laughed too loud, would have wanted. And Steinar has told me so, and did not break when he said it, which took 2 years. I am a healer again. That is the thing I am most glad of, more than the rest of it. Steinar gave me back my mother's trade before he gave me anything else, a proper still room, and leave to train others, and the whole of a keep that had spent 10 years afraid of a fever, now unafraid to be tended by the woman who proved it was never a fever at all. I train healers' daughters. Mostly, I teach them to smell the root the way my mother taught me. I tell them that a sickness that reads the seating is not a sickness, and I make them learn it until they will know it in the dark, and I do not tell them why it matters as much as it does. Because they are young. And there is time. I still wonder about Estrin, honestly, more than I wonder about the border houses that paid him. They wanted a treaty stopped, and bought a murder to stop it, and there is no mystery in men like that. But Estrin poured a slow poison into a family's food for a week, and then spent 10 years being the gentlest, most tender keeper of the survivor's grief, setting the table, speaking softly, tending the wound he had made, every single night, with what looked exactly like love. I have never been able to decide whether some part of him believed it, whether a man can do a monstrous thing and then spend 10 years so carefully guarding the shape of it that the guarding starts to feel, even to him, like devotion. Tell me in the comments what you think a man like that tells himself at night. I have thought about it more than I want to, and I still do not know. And I am not sure I want to. Comment the chair if you want to hear what Steinar's wolf did the first night the hall was full again, and where it chose to lie down. And if you want more nights like this one, a king who mourned a fever for 10 years 3 feet from the man who poured it, a healer's daughter who slept in the one chair no one would touch, and a table finally cleared for the living, stay close. There is more of Redmarsh left to tell. Where are you listening from tonight? I would love to know.